We've had a last minute change of plans today. You've probably heard there's a hurricane bearing down on Florida. Well, Heath, who usually presents the content for these episodes, had weather related technical difficulties. He's not going to be able to join us today, but we still want to give you some useful content. So, we are doing a Throwback Thursday edition today that is very much on topic with cybersecurity. We ran a series with our partner AvePoint beginning of last year, and I've selected a 23-minute section for you to watch today. The premise is what happens if you lose data in Microsoft 365? And did you know that Microsoft says they aren't liable for any data loss? It also goes into regulating data access in your environment. If you want to watch the rest of the webinar series, you can visit forthright.com/M365-webinar-series.
From a ground level, right? So what did we get when we went to the cloud? Because you kind of called it out before. You said, Microsoft is helping us, making sure we could take that file share and go to the cloud, right? That's really what they did. They made sure that you had a place to put your data, right? But what you're responsible for as an end customer is still your data, right? What your users have access to, what they, control, delete, right? All of those different stories, because Microsoft's, again, their service is to the actual service of OneDrive itself, to SharePoint itself, to Exchange, to make sure that those are up and running. So you don't have to have a bunch of servers actually dedicated to running that application, right? So that's what we're getting when we go to M365. And when we start there, we get a really good sense of me as an organization. When I said I wanted to go to the cloud to allow my users to be more flexible with where they work, right? What are some of the risks that I now inherit by doing that? And not necessarily in the bad way, right? Because again, now this data is available, it's potentially more enriched with more metadata, right? But I have some different vehicles where I have to make sure I have a practice for. We kind of talk about this too from, a lot of leaderships kind of understand the story too, where it's like it's no longer CapEx for managing this, right? It's also now OpEx for managing this along in the same footing. I have to look at this in an ongoing way for what is my data actually doing inside of my environment? Who's deleting it, right? Am I protected in the case of ransomware, right? What is versioning and kind of the ceiling level there? So we see this on, on a lot more of a tactical level, right? Things like recycle bins. If a user deletes a file, how long is it available in a recycle bin, right? Or if I pull a license off of a user, how long do I have to go get that data out of their mailbox before it's gone, right? And that data is non-recoverable for me as an organization that I might need for an audit, or I might need for an ongoing project, or they documented a practice and then they're no longer there. So that's again where we say Microsoft, just to make sure it's clear, Microsoft's helping out with that service, right? You don't need to have Exchange servers on premise anymore. We've taken Active Directory to the cloud, but all those wonderful things. SharePoint's no longer this bank of SQLs that's hiding in a closet somewhere. It's a service to us, which is great, right? But we have to understand for that service, the customer responsibility is still going to be the users, the data, the permissions, who your application administrator is, right? And what their activities that they do inside of that environment. I think we can go to the next slide. And so this kind of also ties back to the story we were talking about before, because now we understand it from like a data protection perspective, right? But now let's talk about something like Teams, right? Everyone's using Teams. They're trying to make sure Teams is going well, right? What we've seen is kind of a consistent or growing story is saying, okay, I understand it from a data protection context, right? Somebody deletes something. If I'm able to get that back through a recycle bin for a limited window, I'll be okay. But like, what's my larger practice if my admin changes something? If I'm hit with a ransomware event, what's my good copy that's separate from my environment? That's one side of it. The other side of it is that we don't all work with the same kinds of data, right? What we say is like, hey, here's the company travel policy. That's generally available to all audiences. We really don't mind that, right? But if I'm working on, let's say, an SOW or a pricing contract for a customer, I might not necessarily want everybody in the company to have access to that. I definitely don't want everybody externally to have access to that, because that's not a least privilege model that works for me. But there's also a hidden layer behind that, because that's also not how people work, right? So if I'm working on something with, let's say, my manager or my boss, I'm working on a Word document, it's inside of a Teams chat, we're going ahead and punching this up back and forth just to make sure that it's working. That data is actually stored on OneDrive, right? So that data is actually a part of a OneDrive library for those users that are actually going back and forth on Teams chat. I might take that same file and say, okay, now it's inside of a channel. We're going to hold it as a part of our library for upcoming work, right? And then now that file is in a SharePoint document library on the back end, because surprise, everything from a data perspective on the back end is SharePoint, right? And then I might even go to what's now a Teams private channel, or we see it with shared channels, right? Again, that data is now in a separate site collection, right? But if I think about the human element behind this, there's multiple copies of this likely along the way, right? I'm going to do a save as new and I'm going to put it somewhere else, right? So as I'm developing this or working on this content with my manager, or if I'm sharing this out with external parties that are added as team members, right? There's different versions of this. And now let's change it for a second and let's not pretend that this is the travel policy, right? Let's pretend it's the budget. Maybe it's a roadmap. Maybe it's something sensitive to us that we don't necessarily want publicly available. I have 3 different copies of this data with unique permission sets in 3 different locations, right? How am I controlling that? What's my auditing story, right? How do I answer at any given point who has access to this? So this is just one workload, not to mention when we think about Yammer, right? If I have things going through Exchange, right, and some other stories. So this is some of the things we have to be aware of when we say we want modern workplace. That's great. How do we do that with confidence? This is some of the things we have to know before we kind of go into that. And so again, I think this is a really good note too, right? Because we talked about this and you said it almost before. We knew how to do this on premise, right? On premises was really easy. We had the firewall, right? We had the network boundary, right? As long as it was inside the perimeter, everything was fine, right? And so we had our physical security, our network defense. What we want to do is kind of take a step back here, because now that we're in M365 and Microsoft's taking care of a lot of these different endpoint controls on their application servers, right? We need to now take ownership of the part we're left with, which is looking at this not from the outside in, but more from the inside out. So we can go ahead and kick off a couple of the animations here, but it's more of saying, okay, from external users, right? For if I look at just sensitive data right in the middle, right? Who has access to that inside of my environment, right? What do they have access to inside of my environment? How are we answering this question today, right? And then if I think about it again from the inside out, the part that I'm responsible for, how is this data permeating, maybe not just with external users, but with other departments, right? How is this getting shared? Is it posted in, places that make sense? Does every team need to have PII inside of it, right? Are we taking roster calls inside of every single team that I have in my environment, or SharePoint site collection? So we could start looking at the architecture a little bit differently, but we have to kind of look at it and understand where this problem lies, right? Microsoft's helping us out with things like MFA, right? We have an endpoint, there's some data centers with some very large fences, right? So we have some good physical security. But when I need to look at what I'm responsible for, which is my sensitive data and how that's being shared, that's how we need to kind of start looking at this problem.
We see that often too, because sometimes they'll create a new location to store data and collaborate, and then all of a sudden it's not that I've protected some area and this area only certain people can see. My users now created a new area and started dropping documents, and now all of a sudden the protection or the security set for that particular area may not be sufficient. The documents all have different sensitivity levels, and what we see is our clients don't really have an efficient or an effective way of dealing with that. And if they do, they're not actually deploying the tools that they have available because they're just not aware of it. So yeah, that creates a really interesting problem that goes beyond this kind of security model.
And you said it too, right? So it's almost like the end users didn't tell IT that workspace is there,
Right.
right? So
Yeah,
and then
right.
IT is going back through a vine and saying, what's this for, right? Who made this? What kind of data is this? So that's kind of what we're seeing now. That was the difference for file shares. Users could make folders, but it was very much controlled to AD permissions, right? A
And
whole
it was
different world.
limited. It was also limited to internal users. And so that's the other
That's it.
thing that's really unique here is now all of a sudden I can add external guests. And so I'm exposing data that I'm thinking is secure, and now is not, because somebody has decided to add someone externally. And listen, that's the point of the tool, right? I mean, this is one of the collaborative benefits that we have from it. But obviously, it opens up all new concerns that when we had a file server, we never had this issue, because the thing that you could do is you could email it, you could download it to a USB drive, but we have DLP solutions to address that. And so then the question becomes, what is the solution? How do we address this new way of causing these complications for IT?
Yep. Yeah, or just, this is where we start to acknowledge, right? This is why we need a data governance
Right.
strategy, right? Data governance, we're going to have the big magical word, right? What does this mean? This is the core of that question, right? How do we want to do things like sharing, right? Where should that be happening? How should that look? What workload is it in, right? Who do we do it with on a regular basis? That's the kind of initial. What are we protecting? What's available to us? What's our internal SLA? A lot of those stories are part of that data governance strategy.
And how do we focus on not spending all
Yeah,
these cycles on data we don't care about? I mean, that's
that's
the
true.
other issue. Is the truth is it's a percentage. You know, depending on your business and your vertical, it could be 5%, it could be 80%, but there's a percentage of the data that you really care about, and then the rest is less sensitive you don't care about. And I don't,
Yep,
you know, they don't really have strategies to address that.
that's it. Then you can go to the next slide here too. And so this is kind of that, you know, where do I sit in all of this, right? So almost kind of from the bottom up, right? If I'm looking at, you know, me as a leader of an organization, what we've heard from our customers and saying, you know, how can I say what should I be focusing on? These are some really good places to kind of get started with this, right? And saying, okay, very quickly, we don't want to waste cycles on data that doesn't matter, right? My travel policy that's available to 700 users, right? We're completely fine with that. Where is all my sensitive data, right? Do we know who has access to it, right? Is IT or the technical teams or the technical leadership aware on, you know, how often this is reviewed, right? Do I need to have it proposed to anybody else for an audit reason later on, right? And then again, because those end users are making newer workspaces all on their own, when are they telling back to the business, right? What membership is appropriate, what external identities are required, right? And then ultimately, because again, we're still looking at the threat landscape being what it is, we have things like ransomware, we have things like hack-a-vision, right? Well, there's plenty of things out there that we need to be concerned about. So we got to say, okay, from a principle of like, you know, kind of stealing from the zero trust story, right? What is my remediation strategy if any account gets compromised, right? If the end user that works in accounting, if they get compromised, what's my remediation strategy to getting that data back, right? Not just for getting back up and running purposes, but also to make sure that I don't lose that data, right? And so can I start looking at kind of like my threat vectors a little bit more accurately, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's interesting because none of these typically come up when you're talking about the migration project.
Right.
It's very focused on let's just get the data over so
Right.
we can decommission our file servers. And none of these things actually come up in that conversation, which is something that, you know, we tend to try to pause with our clients and talk about it. But obviously, at this point, many people have already made the transition and they're just not aware, or they are aware of these challenges now, and they're trying to figure out how to address them.
Yep. That's it. All right, and I think we can open this one up here. Yep. And this is kind of that same story, right? So we have to have, okay, where do I get started in all of this, right? The way we kind of approach this is saying, okay, what kind of data do we have, right? We need to be able to answer that question. Is it PII, PCI? Is it something I have to have, you know, called out separately because it's board reports, right? Is it my pricing list? Is it my plan for marketing next year, right? Whatever the case is that I know is going to be for restricted audiences, right? And then let's separate that from everything else, right? Our PTO policy, our leave policy, right? I need to have those available to everybody else. And then I go, okay, now I need to get a separate bucket and say, what are the external identities we're working with, right? Not just the individuals. What organizations are they? Are they contractors? Are they outsourced resources, right? What are those external identities? And what is our sharing controls for them, right? And then now I need to say, okay, with those two, which ones are falling outside of policy for us, right? What internal resources have too many external eyes on it, right? What sensitive documents have any, right? So that's kind of the process that I need to start going down outside of the general story, just making sure I have a protection strategy in place. We can go to the next slide. So again, this is kind of that story, Steve, we were talking about before, because part of that licensing is that I'm going to have protection for loss of data due to hardware failure, right? So Microsoft has things like geo redundancy and local redundancy, and making sure that they have some way of making sure that Exchange is online, right? And then your content's going to be there. So their service is going to keep what's active. What that doesn't prevent us from, you know, facing impacts of is user error, admin error, right? Ransomware, and having a path to get forward to say, if I lose access to this data, right, can I get it back? Because that's like some of the questions we're seeing now from customers is like not even just a remediation strategy for having one, right, and just how to deal with this, but it's also coming up as, you know, how long can I go without it for my operations?
Well, we also see a couple of other issues. We see that a lot of our clients feel that, well, I don't really need to back up this data because it's in Outlook and I can always grab a PST file. One, obviously, there's limitations with that, and if you have any kind of massive outage, that's not a very good plan of recovery. But the truth is, there's so much more data now in 365 because that's maybe where what started moving people over. But when you look at the use of SharePoint Teams, OneDrive, Planner, all the other applications that are integrated with it, there's so much data out there that is not obvious, that we're not really tracking, that people don't think about. And then on top of that, in the past, maybe we had multiple file servers and we had different backup strategies depending on which data was really important for the business, and the other stuff that, well, the user profiles, their home drives, I'm not going to worry too much about that because they have a place to put their critical data. And so maybe we don't back that up. The problem is it's all now mixed up and we don't have control of where users are moving and copying their data and how they're sharing it, because this platform is designed to give them this kind of capability to add to their productivity. And so therefore, making sure that you have visibility to all those data sets become really important. And again, what we're seeing in the field is a lot of people are, they're not aware and they're not thinking about it. Because from their perspective, I only have to worry about the version that's sitting in this one place that I know about, but I don't know about all these other pieces.
Right.
And it becomes a big issue. We've seen this happen. And I even have a client that actually had a very odd, and I've only seen this once, but they had a very odd situation with Microsoft where, in spite of having payments go through, Microsoft, and there's lawsuits involved in this, they made an error and they basically shut down the account and deleted the account, even though everything was paid. And
Right.
the customer then had a serious problem because they had no way to recover. And even Microsoft at that point, I think it took them something like 4 weeks to bring that back. And how do you
That's 4
operate your
weeks of
business?
downtime.
That's 4 weeks of downtime. It's still an ongoing thing, and I've never seen this happen. But these are the kind of things we have to worry about as professionals, and the people on the call. We have to worry about these, even though they probably will never happen. They might. It's our job to be stewards over all this data, and now it's much more difficult to do that now that we don't have direct control of it anymore. Yeah, carry on. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about how we deal with this.
Yeah. So again, how do we actually secure our data, right? And so Steve, we've seen Forthright lead a lot of these stories too and execute them really well for customers, and that's having a way to say, what's my governance policy, right? Who do we share with, and where does data go, right? Because I have to think about that a little bit more than just the file shares that I had inside of my boundary before, right? I need to be a little bit more smart and say, okay, Yammer's our outer loop. Teams is our inner loop, and we'll have some maybe SharePoint site collections that are going to be completely walled off, and maybe others, and OneDrive is our external sharing vehicle. But that decision has to be made to guide these users, right? And then we need to also be able to audit some of those follow-on things, right? But then I also have to look at the other side, right? Whether it's Microsoft's deleted my things, unfortunately, like for that one customer, but even more, just more widespread things too, where we have ransomware. Your data is going to be in there, but it's going to be encrypted unless you pay, right? You need to have a separate copy of it somewhere to be able to defend that data from, again, not just the downtime, but then the ongoing remediation from a ransomware event, right? There's almost like 2 costs that happen with that. So, okay, user error, ransomware, corruption, right? I need to have a way to get just the content itself, never mind the sharing and everything else, just the content itself back in and available as it was, right? So those are some of the core things of saying, how do I secure my data, or what is my data governance strategy going to kind of look like when we think about some of those self-assessment questions here?
You brought up an interesting point because it's not just even restoring the data, it's making sure that all the permissions and tagging and all of that is also restored along with it, because otherwise you've got your data back and you have a nightmare of trying to figure out how to protect it now that it's back. Excellent point.
Yeah, so I mean that's really it. And then having one place to do it from definitely helps, right? We don't have to already go. There's plenty of admin centers out in the world. We don't need to have too many more just to be able to kind of tackle this problem as well.
The funny thing is, it's assumed that that's built in because that's what we used to have with file servers, but it's not in all solutions. And so it's one of those things that obviously as data management is evolving, and we're all as a community learning all these different risks. We have to address it, and some solutions address that better than others. Kristen, let's go to the next slide.
So this is it, right? So this is something that, Forthright's been a leading a partner of AvePoint's in understanding this story and making sure that it's applicable to the business cases of the clients that they work with, right? Because we see it a lot of ways, but from what we see from an M365 side, but Forthright's had a lot of expertise in working with these businesses and groups and being able to make sure they can get to the tangible outcomes that they're looking for their specific practice. So Steve, I'll let you kind of speak a little bit more to this.
Well, some of this we've talked about. I think what's really important is having the ability of having unlimited data storage. I think is a significant piece here, because we know that the more space you have, the more you use. And Microsoft, part of their value proposition is to give you a ton of storage. And our users tend to use their OneDrives for all sorts of things. Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. And the worst thing is that if you do have some kind of cap there, not only do you have runaway cost, which is a problem, obviously for our budgets, but the last thing you want is backups not to finish, or certain pieces of data not being backed up because there's a storage scenario there. And obviously on-demand backups, which are very close to real time, is really nice. And we also like the fact that the policy enforcement mechanisms, and I don't know how deep we're going to get into it today. It's one of the reasons why we have 3 sessions here, because there's a lot to unpack in these conversations. So hopefully those of you who are with us, you'll join us for the other 2 sessions as well, because we're going to continue to get into not just the data protection, but how we deal with the governance and then the enforcement of that governance, and how the heck you manage all of this in an efficient way. And it's all going to come out in these conversations, and we'll be able to show you some of this as we get into session 2 and session 3. And then the other thing is that maybe I don't need a full restore, because maybe the issue is that the data is there, but I've made a human error, I've deleted it, I've gone in and deleted out data because I've got somebody that with malice, and I don't need to restore everything. I want to be able to pick a specific file, a folder, a Teams channel maybe. I want to be granular in my restoration, and we can do this. And a lot of this can be self-service, which is really nice. It's very easy for IT to be able to do this, with your tool set. We've had a lot of good success with that.
Yeah, no, and I think what Forthright here has kind of put around this offering, right, and understanding, let's get to a compliance state for customers. Let's, use the tools with AvePoint, right, but more importantly, being able to apply it to that business case of saying, like, this is the outcome you're looking for. If you need a data governance strategy, right, how do we actually get started there? If I need to make sure I am protected, what are some of the gaps that I might not even be aware of? Maybe just not even at M365, maybe it's something else in like an Azure footing, right? So there's plenty more to talk about there, but I think this offering here from Forthright's been, really impactful for us to even learn from, and some of the ways that your team has been able to kind of take this to customers and make sure that they get on track to having a good governance strategy for M365. Because right, it's no longer CapEx for security, right, and CapEx for my purchases. It's an OpEx and ongoing piece as well.
Yeah, I think the probably the big thing I think for us also is to help clients figure out how do we deploy conditional access. Because now you have this tool that I can access anything, anywhere, and we want that because that drives a lot of productivity and capability. But we have to have controls, and we have to be able to understand who is the user actually connecting, where are they connecting from, and maybe I want to change what access you have. It's not a one size fits all, where in a file server you either had access or you didn't, or maybe you had read-only access. This has kind of changed all of that, and unfortunately for us, Microsoft's given the control to the user to determine how they're going to share it, because you can share a document and you can set whether it's read-only or view or whatever. And if we don't have policies preset and we don't have a mechanism to actually monitor and see it on how this compliance is actually working, then the users can actually undo a lot of the security that we started with. And so I think that's a key part of this whole conversation we're going to have over the next 3 series.
Okay, everyone, thank you for your time today. We appreciate your flexibility. We'll go back to the series on identity and access management on October 10th. If you like the series, please share this video with a colleague or invite them to join at success.forthright.com/cyberseries. Have a great day.